Hey guys, how y'all doing tonight? Welcome to another episode of Hockey on the Spot with Brandon Barenfeld. I'm Brandon Barenfeld. Thank y'all for joining me tonight. This is episode 158 of Hockey on the Spot. And for today's episode, we're going to continue with the NHL's 30 teams in 30 days. And for today's episode, we're going to talk about the Vancouver Canucks. They are the final Canadian team that we're going to talk about this year. The Vancouver Canucks, again, are the final Canadian team to talk about. So let's dive right into it. Last year, a very interesting year for the Vancouver Canucks, to say the least. It was a year where they came out of the lockout Jordan year after making the playoffs 2 years. After making the playoffs and being eliminated in the first round 2 years straight in 2012 by the Los Angeles Kings after winning the President's Trophy for the second straight year. And then in 2013, they got swept by the San Jose Sharks. So two first-round eliminations since making the Stanley Cup Finals and losing to the Boston Bruins in 7 games. After 2013's first-round misery, the Vancouver Canucks decided that it was time to part ways with longtime head coach Alain Vigneault. Alain Vigneault ultimately would go on to coach the New York Rangers and lead them to the Stanley Cup Finals, where they lost in 5 games to the Los Angeles Kings. But as for the Vancouver Canucks, they would go on and get John Tortorella from the very same New York Rangers team. So it was kind of a coaching trade, if you will. And in the early going, it looked like Vancouver had that coaching trade won because the Rangers really struggled in the beginning of the year, and Vancouver didn't look out of place in the beginning of the year. They were doing great in the beginning of the year, and 3/4 of the way through the season, they were in a playoff spot. It really all came down to a home game against the Calgary Flames. Just 2 seconds into the game, a huge line brawl occurs between the two teams. And then, at the end of the first period, John Tortorella goes and attempts an attack on the Calgary Flames head coach, Bob Hartley. And it did not look good on the team. I believe Tortorella did finish out the remainder of the game, and Vancouver did go on to win that game, but that pretty much was the turning point of their season. John Tortorella got suspended for 6 games. He could not coach for 6 games. And Vancouver did not do well while he was gone, and when he came back, they still looked like a team that no longer had faith in their coach. They went on to suffer an epic collapse throughout the rest of the season. They were the home team for the Heritage Classic against the Ottawa Senators. Eddie Lack would start that game rather than Roberto Luongo, which ultimately led to Roberto Luongo being traded to the Florida Panthers in exchange for forward Sean Mathias, goaltender Jacob Markstrom, and yeah. But after you consider the off timing of trading Corey Schneider to the New Jersey Devils and not getting enough back, and then now trading Roberto Luongo off timing as well to the Florida Panthers, the Vancouver Canucks pretty much shot themselves in the foot, and then general manager Mike Gillis really put a hole on the team. And last year, the Sedin twins, Henrik and Daniel, did not look like the players we're used to seeing them look like. Last year was a very rough year for the Sedin twins, the former Art Ross Trophy winners. As we quickly go and take a look at the Vancouver Canucks from an individual standpoint. Henrik Sedin still finished as the team's leader in point scoring, but it was not a typical Henrik Sedin year. He only had 50 points, 11 goals and 39 assists. And as for Daniel Sedin, it was not a good year for him at all. Just 16 goals and 31 assists for 47 points. Henrik Sedin played 70 games, and Daniel Sedin played 73. Daniel Sedin is usually a 20-goal scorer. Henrik Sedin usually gets closer to 20 goals. They were both plus players at the end of the year. Well, Daniel Sedin was an even rating. Henrik was a +3. And that was something about Torts. Oh, yeah. Henrik Sedin only had 97 shots on goal. He normally pours on more shots than that, despite the fact that he is a playmaker. Daniel Sedin, however, did have 224 shots on goal. So he had a lot of shots on goal. Surprisingly for the Vancouver Canucks, known for being more of an offensive threat, they only had one 20-goal scorer last year, and that was Ryan Kessler, who had 25. 25 goals, 18 assists, 43 points, a -15 rating, 81 penalty minutes, and 239 shots on goal through 77 games. He was not a very happy player playing in Vancouver last year. It was not a good year. And that's because Tortorella tried to infuse more defensive responsibilities onto the Sedins, diminishing some of their offense. And under Tortorella, he is not a four-line coach, and in today's game, you need to be a four-line coach. He is the type of coach who wants his players to sit back, let the opportunities come to them. And at one time, maybe that worked. Obviously, John Tortorella was the head coach of the 2004 Tampa Bay Lightning, and obviously led them to a Stanley Cup. So back in those days, maybe it worked, but not in today's game. In today's game, you need to be able to push the pace. You need to roll through four lines rather than just your top six, and then only your third line on occasions, and then maybe only one or two shifts for the fourth line the whole game, or one shift a period for the fourth line. It doesn't work like that in today's game. The defensemen last year were just so off for the Vancouver Canucks. They were not. It was just not a good year for them. At all, the defenseman Jason Garrison actually had a pretty nice year. He had tied a career high 33 points. But he was a -5. But the key guy, the guy who they consider to be their key defenseman, Alexander Edler, was just horrendous last year. Through 63 games played, only 7 goals, 15 assists, and 22 points. But that wasn't even the worst of it for Alexander Edler. That wasn't even the worst of it for Alexander Edler. The worst of it was his career low and league worst -39 rating, while having 50 penalty minutes and 178 shots on goal. But that -39 rating was a career low for him at a league worst. He was such a bad player last year. There were barely any situations last year where he was a plus player. He really did not look like the Alexander Edler we had come to know in recent years. I mean, we saw him at -3 on a lot of occasions this past season. He just did not look like Alexander Edler. He really didn't. So it was a very bad season for him. So, as well as the rest of the Vancouver Canucks squad. As far as the team as a whole, plus minus wise, the team finished -18, which was 23rd in the league, but also locked in a 4-way tie with the Ottawa Senators, Nashville Predators, and the Carolina Hurricanes. They allowed more goals than they scored. And it was pretty much a typical John Tortorella type year, just without making the playoffs. A typical John Tortorella type year in the sense that they were in the top 15 in goals against. They were 14th in the league, tied for 14th with the Colorado Avalanche at 2.63, but they were put ahead of the Avalanche. And their penalty killing was spectacular last year. Their penalty killing was 9th in the league at an 83.2, tied for 9th with the Winnipeg Jets, but they also were ahead of the Winnipeg Jets in that category. So it was a good year as far as goals against and penalty killing was concerned, which you expect under a John Tortorella type system. But as far as goals for and power plays percentage, just horrendous for the Vancouver Canucks. 28th in the league in goals for at 33.33%. Only the Florida Panthers and the Buffalo Sabres finished with a worse goals for percentage than the Vancouver Canucks. Buffalo was the worst. Florida was the second worst. And on the power play, as far as the power play went, their power play 26th in the league at 15.2%, which was just a major decline from the 2010-2011 campaign when their power play was first. And as far as penalties were concerned, they were a very penalized team last year. They were the third most penalized team in the NHL at 13.6 penalty minutes per game. Only the Philadelphia Flyers and the St. Louis Blues finished with more penalties per game than the Vancouver Canucks, and both of them made the playoffs. Now, granted, both of them were eliminated in the first round, the Blues by the Chicago Blackhawks and the Flyers by the New York Rangers, but they still made the playoffs. So, a lot of negatives to look at for the Vancouver Canucks last year. In the end, obviously, when it comes down to the final stretch of that coaching trade, the Rangers not only made the playoffs under Alain Vigneault as the 5th seed, but they stunned everyone and went all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals, and that included beating teams like the Philadelphia Flyers, the Pittsburgh Penguins, Sidney Crosby, and the Montreal Canadiens, a building where they've just been horrible in recent years. They obviously played a much different demon against the Los Angeles Kings and lost in 5 games in that Stanley Cup Final Series. But the fact that they got there under Alain Vigneault and John Tortorella gets the boot after his first year tells you that the Rangers won that coaching trade by a long shot, because Vigneault will be back in New York for his second year. John Tortorella gets the boot after one season as the Rangers head coach, and he not only got the boot, so did then general manager Mike Gillis. Both of them were let go by Vancouver ownership, which tells you that a full change was made. That changes were made all over the place. And as the new general manager came former Boston Bruins assistant general manager Jim Benning, who knew the Vancouver Canucks very well after being an assistant GM for the Bruins during that 2010-2011 season when the Bruins played the President's Trophy winning Vancouver Canucks in the Stanley Cup Finals and beat them in 7 games. So Benning knows the Vancouver Canucks from back then, and he knows the potential that they have, and he knows the type of team that they are able to be. And then once Jim Benning was hired, he went to work from there, and he started by bringing in Willie Desjardins 4 days later to become their new head coach. Willie Desjardins was the head coach of the Texas Stars of the American Hockey League last year and brought them to Calder Cup victory, defeating the St. John's Ice Caps in the final round. But Willie Desjardins was the head coach for the Calder Cup championship winning Texas Stars, and now he takes on a bigger role in his first NHL head coaching job, now with the Vancouver Canucks. So that was great for the moves by the Vancouver Canucks. Basically this whole offseason was a rebuild for the Canucks. They're in rebuild mode, not the same type of rebuild like the Calgary Flames or the Edmonton Oilers, not just yet, but rebuild in the sense where they were offloading key players and bringing in a new core. Obviously, the Sedin twins will be back. There's no doubt about it. Alexander Burrows will be back. He was a guy who had an off year last year offensively. He did some other things that were really good for the team, but offensively it was his worst year since joining the league. But a lot of changes were made by the Vancouver Canucks, and obviously it all started at the draft. Defenseman Andrew Alberts and defenseman Jan Sauve are both still on unrestricted free agents, and neither of them will be back. At the draft, the Vancouver Canucks went to work. They bought during the compliance buyout period. They used a compliance buyout to buy out left winger David Booth. He eventually went on to sign with the Toronto Maple Leafs. And centerman Mike Santorelli would join him. He also would sign with the Toronto Maple Leafs. They let go of center Zach Dolpe as he went on to sign with the Buffalo Sabres. And also, former first-round pick Jordan Schrader was let go, and he went on to sign with the Minnesota Wild. Jordan Schrader has not been the player that they expected him to be. He was their first-round, 22nd overall pick during the 2009 NHL draft. And with the roster that they have, there's really no room for him to crack a roster spot in Vancouver. He's going to have to try with the Minnesota Wild. He's 23 years of age. He'll be 24 on September 29th. So hopefully everything works out for Jordan. But also let go at the draft. But the big players that were let go were players that were let go at the draft. They let go of long-time second-line center Ryan Kessler and their top offensive defenseman from last year, Jason Garrison. They went on to trade defenseman Jason Garrison, the rights to forward Jeff Costello, and a draft pick to the Tampa Bay Lightning in exchange for another draft pick. And just today, the Syracuse Crunch, the American Hockey League affiliate of the Bolts, went on to sign forward Jeff Costello to an American Hockey League deal. So now the Lightning officially have him in their system. They have very high hopes for that kid. But the big piece of that trade was Jason Garrison. They didn't get much back, and that was intentional because that trade was just more of a cap dump than anything. But the big player that Jason Garrison was traded directly at the draft, but traded just before the draft, was longtime second-line center Ryan Kessler, and that was considered the second biggest trade of the offseason next to the Jason Spezza deal. This deal actually came before the Spezza deal because the Spezza deal came during free agency, just before free agency started. The Vancouver Canucks would trade Ryan Kessler and a third-round pick in 2015 to the Anaheim Ducks, and in return, the Vancouver Canucks would acquire center Nick Bonino, defenseman Lucas Biza, the Ducks' first-round 24th overall pick, and their third-round 85th overall pick. Although they would not keep that 85th overall pick, they went on to trade it. They would go on to trade it to the New York Rangers to acquire forward Derek Dorsett. And the second-round 50th overall pick that they got from the Tampa Bay Lightning in the Jason Garrison deal was also traded to the Los Angeles Kings in order to acquire LA's top prospect, Lyndon Vay. So, let's break down all these trades that we just talked about. As I mentioned before, gone was Ryan Kessler, and in return for Ryan Kessler, they get a couple of players who were key parts of the Ducks over a couple of years. Lucas Biza had a bit of a rough year last year. He was hurt most of last year and therefore lost his place in the top six and really fell out of favor. But when he's healthy and playing at his best, he's a really effective shutdown defenseman who moves the puck well, skates well, can play the body well. and just does a little bit of everything. When he's completely healthy, he has become the ideal depth defenseman in the league. He's a former 19th overall pick in 2008 by the Philadelphia Flyers. He ended up becoming the centerpiece for the Ducks in that Chris Pronger trade with the Philadelphia Flyers all those years ago. And the Vancouver Canucks are sure hoping that Lucas Sbisa can help them just the way he did with the Ducks up until last season. They hope if they get the Lucas Sbisa from last year, then they're not getting a very good player. But if they can release the Lucas Sbisa from years past, then they're getting the ideal depth defenseman in the league. One of the ideal depth defensemen in the league who plays a very simple game, does a little bit of everything, and does good things out there and is very consistent. Now with Nick Bonino, he's probably the centerpiece as far as the return goes for Ryan Kesler. Nick Bonino really never reached that second line center spot last year, despite the fact that he put up the numbers identical to those of a second line center. I think Nick Bonino was very underrated last year, and the Ducks were at their best when he was in their lineup. Through 77 games last year, he had 22 goals, 27 assists, and 49 points, all career highs. He had a plus 14 rating, a career high. Only 22 penalty minutes, which isn't a lot, but it's also a career high. And 159 shots on goal, which is a career high. And in the playoffs, 13 games played, 4 goals, 4 assists, and 8 points, all career highs. One of those 4 goals included the Game 6 overtime winner in their first round series against the Dallas Stars to advance them to the second round to play the Los Angeles Kings. He was a plus 3 with only 8 penalty minutes and 22 shots on goal, all career highs as well. So Nick Bonino was a clutch player last year for the Ducks. Most of his goals came in clutch situations. He knew how to score overtime winners and game winners. That was a big part of Nick Bonino's game last year. But he's more of a playmaker than a goal scorer. And the Vancouver Canucks are really hoping that Bonino could really take on that second line center job. He has the potential, and he's got great hands. He's 26 years of age, so he's 4 years younger than Ryan Kesler and has another year to grow. Great hands, skates well, and does a little bit of everything. He's pretty much become an all-around player. And if I were a Ducks fan, you're getting Ryan Kesler, and you got to be willing to give up anything to get him. The Ducks needed a true second-line center, which Ryan Kesler is, even at 30 years of age. But Nick Bonino, he's really becoming a player who, though is more of a playmaker, did a little bit of everything last year, and including playing clutch for the Ducks. Which means if I'm the Ducks, I'm going to hate going against the Vancouver Canucks this year because Nick Bonino did not want to leave Anaheim, and he really envisioned himself being there for a long time, and you could just see him scoring a game-winning goal against his former team, and the Canucks being a tough team for the Ducks to play against this year. That's the big question mark about this trade. What if Ryan Kesler doesn't pan out to be what the Ducks bargained for? Because last year, Nick Bonino actually had more points and a better plus-minus than Ryan Kesler. Ryan Kesler, he had more goals, but Nick Bonino, to me, was a better all-around player last year. But Ryan Kesler is expected to have a better year under head coach Bruce Boudreau. Nick Bonino, who knows what you're going to get under Willie Desjardins. He obviously led the Texas Stars to the Calder Cup, so obviously he's a guy who you got to think knows what he's doing. So Nick Bonino, to start the year, will play the second-line center spot. And I really do hope it works out for Bonino. They're going to rely on him to be clutch just as much as he was for the Anaheim Ducks last year. If he can be, then all of a sudden it's going to look like an even-sided trade. Because also acquired in that deal by Vancouver was the 24th overall pick, which gave Vancouver 2 first-round picks in that draft. They had the 6th overall pick initially, which they used to select right winger Jake Virtanen, a Canadian forward of Finnish descent. He's going to be a real good player in the future. And with the pick that they got from the Ducks, they selected center Jared McCann, who's eventually expected to be a second-line center. He'll be expected to come up and be a second-line center at some point in his career. But it didn't stop there, because the Vancouver Canucks also used the 36th overall selection to select the highly touted goaltender Thatcher Demko. He was the number 1 ranked goaltender last year, native of California. He wasn't the first goaltender picked, but he was the highest ranked goaltender last year, and he is going to be a great goaltender, and it's a great reserve guy for the Vancouver Canucks to have for their future. He was selected with the 36th overall pick, and with the 66th overall pick, they selected defenseman Nikita Tryamkin, a Russian defenseman who plays a two-way style. He'll be a solid depth defenseman in the future. That's for sure. He'll just continue to refine his game, but it's going to be a while before he's in the NHL. But that's what the Vancouver Canucks got, and I mentioned they got the 85th overall pick as well in the 3rd round. They went on to trade that pick to the New York Rangers, and in doing so, acquired enforcer Derek Dorsett. Derek Dorsett coming over from the New York Rangers. Derek Dorsett did not turn out to be what the Rangers thought he was going to be. They really envisioned him to be a Brandon Pruss type player, and to bring the same kind of energy that Pruss brought in. And it didn't happen for Derek Dorsett, at least not during the regular season. He finally showed flashes of what he could really do when playing at his best during the Stanley Cup Finals. He was actually one of the Rangers' better players in the Stanley Cup Finals. So from there, it looked like Dorsett was finally showing what he could really do, which makes you ask, was this the right time for the Rangers to trade Derek Dorsett? And did Vancouver get him at the right time? It's very possible, because Derek Dorsett, when playing at his best, skates well, is one of those enforcers that not just fights, but forechecks. Like Brandon Pruss, he's a forechecker, and he generates offensive zone opportunities. He gave that 4th line a lot of jump during the Stanley Cup Finals. And he does a lot of good things out there. So, great trade acquisition by the Vancouver Canucks. I think it'll work out. It adds depth to their bottom 6, and it gives them a bit more of an edge than they had before. And then they also, as I mentioned, in the Jason Garrison trade, got the 50th overall pick in the 2nd round. They also went on to trade that pick, and they traded it to the defending Stanley Cup champion Los Angeles Kings and acquired center Lyndon Vay. Lyndon Vay was one of the highly touted prospects in the Los Angeles system. He just turned 23 years of age. He was a former 4th round, 96th overall pick from the 2009 NHL draft. Last year, he was very good for the Manchester Monarchs of the American Hockey League. Was one of their best players. Has always been one of the better players in the American Hockey League. But last year he was so good that he was rewarded with an 18-game call-up by the Kings. He didn't have any goal, but he didn't do much during that time. He didn't have any goals, and he only had 5 assists for 5 points. The good news is that he was even in plus-minus, and he didn't have any penalty minutes, but he only generated 8 shots on goal. So, for the Los Angeles Kings, a roster being as loaded as it is, and knowing that Lyndon Vay had the tools to be an NHL player, they knew they had to trade him because he wasn't going to be an NHL player in Los Angeles. They just had way too much depth up front. And with Tyler Toffoli coming up They only had room for one prospect, and Tyler Toffoli is the guy who's won that spot. Lyndon Vay will have a shot with the Vancouver Canucks to really show his stuff. And if he's playing at his best, he's another guy who could actually come up. He not only plays center, he can also play right wing. But if need be, if one of the guys on the top six really doesn't work out, then Lyndon Vay, if he becomes really good, this is a guy who's going to put up some really good numbers and will score some clutch goals for the Vancouver Canucks. I like that the Canucks got him. I think it's an even-sided trade, actually, just considering who the Kings selected with that second-round pick. They selected highly touted offensive defenseman Roland McEwen. He's going to be a good player. So that makes that trade even-sided. But a good move. A good move by the Vancouver Canucks, though. They get a good offensive player, a guy who's really going to come into camp and work hard to get a roster spot. So those are all the players that Vancouver got by trade. Nick Bonino and Lucas Sbisa from the Anaheim Ducks, Lyndon Vay from the Los Angeles Kings, and Derek Dorsett from the New York Rangers. Other than that, they did bring in some other players, though. That wasn't all Vancouver did this offseason. They brought in center Dustin Jeffrey coming over from the Dallas Stars. He actually split last year between the Penguins and the Stars. He'll add some depth to their lineup and gives them a good option as a good 13th forward. They also brought in center Cal O'Reilly, the older brother of Colorado Avalanche forward Ryan O'Reilly. He spent the last couple of years in the KHL, and the last time he played in the NHL was the 2011-12 season, split between the Nashville Predators, the Phoenix Coyotes, and more recently the Pittsburgh Penguins. He's probably just gonna play in the minors. He was probably just added to play for the Utica Comets and add some depth to a Utica Comets team that really was one of the worst teams in the American Hockey League last year. More of a defensive type forward. And they also added defenseman Bobby Sanguinetti. He's coming over from the Carolina Hurricanes affiliate, the Charlotte Checkers. He may battle in training camp for a roster spot, but the most likely destination for him is also the American Hockey League for the Utica Comets. He'll help them out. Very good player, though never truly lived up to his draft status and became a solidified NHL player. Very good in the American Hockey League. One of the better defensemen down there. He didn't play an NHL game last year at all. Last played in the lockout-shortened year with the Carolina Hurricanes. So those are all some minor signings. Cal O'Reilly and Bobby Sanguinetti for the minors. And Dustin Jeffrey, who can toggle between both, but will most likely be the 13th forward up in Vancouver. But they also made two pretty significant signings. One of them being the signing of veteran right winger Radim Verbata, who's coming over from the Arizona Coyotes, or Phoenix Coyotes at the time. He's now 33 years of age, so he's pretty much out of his prime years now, or is in the last year of his prime years. But it's believed that he could still be a really effective player. He believes he can still be a very effective player, and last year he really showed. Through 80 games played, 20 goals, 31 assists, and 51 points. 263 shots on goal and only 22 penalty minutes. The only downside is that he was a -6, but more of an offensive player than a defensive player. But Radim Verbata, to me, has always been one of the most underrated snipers in the game. He has such a good wrist shot, great set of hands, good speed, and he does a little bit of everything, you know. He also works very, very hard out there. He's one of those role players that you need in your top six. Whether he's going to bring the same kind of magic to Vancouver that he did with the Phoenix remains to be seen, because it's been proven that his best years, and really his only good years, have come with the Coyotes. Because when he left the Coyotes after 2008 to go to the Tampa Bay Lightning, he really did not play well at all. he came back to the Coyotes and he shined. He just absolutely shined. His best year was the 2011-2012 campaign when he played 77 games and had 35 goals, 27 assists, and 62 points, a career-high plus 24, and 232 shots on goal, along with only 24 penalty minutes. And in the playoffs that year, through 16 games played, 2 goals, 3 assists, 5 points, a -3, 8 penalty minutes, and 43 shots on goal. So that was his best year. He was so good that year. But like I said, even at 33 years of age, I think he's just one of the more underrated snipers and more underrated skaters in the game. I don't believe he played as a member of the Czech Republic team during the Olympics this past year, Team Czech Republic. Team Czech Republic did not do a good job at choosing what players were going to play, and I believe Radim Vrbata was one of the guys cut off the team who should have been there. So that obviously didn't make him happy. But the hope is that he can, at the very least for this year and maybe next year, bring a good set of offense to Vancouver. Again, he's not getting any younger. They realize that. And maybe they're not exactly expecting him to put up the same kind of numbers as he did before. But if he could put up at least 20 to 25 goals and maybe 45 to 50 points, then Vancouver will be satisfied. Because he's not going to play on the... it's very possible he plays on the top line with the Sedin twins. Or if not, he'll definitely play on the second line. So he'll be one of the more interesting players to watch for Vancouver. But that signing came 3 days after Vancouver's big signing that came on the day of the opening day of free agent frenzy. Their biggest offseason addition this year was the addition of goaltender Ryan Miller, who's coming over from the St. Louis Blues. Ryan Miller actually split the season last year between the Buffalo Sabres and the St. Louis Blues. He began the year last year with the Sabres, and actually played much better than what his record in Buffalo showed. He got to St. Louis along with forward Steve Ott just prior to the trade deadline, and though he was very good in the beginning, toward the end he really struggled, and he did not lead St. Louis to the promised land like maybe they had expected him to, and he became an unrestricted free agent, and St. Louis chose not to bring him back. He's 30. Vancouver took their opportunity and signed the veteran goaltender. He's 6'2", 168 pounds. Last year, for the Sabres and Blues combined, 25 wins, 30 losses, and 4 overtime losses with only 1 shutout. With the Sabres, he had a .923 save percentage and .272 goals against average, while with the Blues, he had a .903 save percentage and .247 goals against average. In the playoffs for the Blues, he started in all 6 games and had 2 wins and 4 losses. No shutouts. A .270 goals against average and .897 save percentage, which was not a good save percentage in the playoffs. Again, the Blues had a 2-0 lead to open that series before Chicago came storming back to win the series in 6 games. Now, Ryan Miller, native of East Lansing, Michigan, we all know what he can do. Always has been one of the more athletic goaltenders in the National Hockey League. Has great reflexes, times his plays well. And he was the cornerstone in goal for the Buffalo Sabres for many years. Obviously, his best year came in the 2009-2010 season, when through 69 games played, he had a career-high 41 wins, 18 losses, 8 overtime losses, and 5 shutouts, at .222 goals against average, and .929 save percentage. In the playoffs that year, through 6 games, though, 2 wins, 4 losses, a .234 goals against average, and .926 save percentage, as they were upset in the first round by the Boston Bruins. But despite being eliminated in the first round of the playoffs that year, Ryan Miller's statistics that year were good enough of a showing to win him the Vezina Trophy during the 2010 season. Not to mention, he was also the MVP of the 2010 Winter Olympics in Vancouver, British Columbia for Team USA when he led them to a silver medal. He was the MVP of that tournament, and well-deserved. That was a big year for Ryan Miller, and some may say that he maybe hasn't been the same since then, but, he's only 6 wins away from 300 career wins, but he's still considered to be a very good goaltender. But really the big concern I have with this signing is the fact that he is 34 years of age. He's officially out of his prime. He's now officially in the years where you look at him and say he's not getting any younger. So the fact that he was signed to a 3-year deal is a little bit mind-boggling for me. Obviously, we all know it's just setting up for what their future holds in goal, whether it's going to be Eddie Lack or Jacob Markstrom, or probably the most likely option to be their starter in the future, Thatcher Demko, who they selected with the 36th overall pick in the second round. He is just going to be something special and will remind many people of Carey Price. He's just that good. The American version, obviously. But Ryan Miller, I think it'll work out. Again, the age is concerning. He may have slowed down a little bit. But he's a little bit younger than Roberto Luongo by a couple of years. So it's going to be interesting to see how well Ryan Miller fares as the starting goaltender for Vancouver. But he is the big signing/acquisition for the Vancouver Canucks this offseason outside of the general manager, Jim Benning, and the head coach, Willie Desjardins. As we now go ahead and take a look at some of the big questions for the Vancouver Canucks this season. And probably the biggest question of all, can Henrik Sedin and Daniel Sedin be elite scorers again? Well, they are both 33 years of age. They'll both be 34 on September 26th. So they're both officially exiting their prime years. So in my opinion, they probably won't be the same players that they have been in the past. They're probably their Art Ross Trophy days and the days of Daniel Sedin winning the Ted Lindsay Trophy and Henrik winning the Hart Trophy in 2010. They both formerly led the league in scoring 2 years in a row. But the days of those Sedin twins are probably long gone. But it's believed that at the very least they can still be effective players in the league, and maybe under a new head coach, a more offensive-minded coach, be 60 to 70 point guys. And Daniel Sedin at the least could be a 20 to 30 goal scorer, while Henrik can get around that amount, but get really around 50 to 60 assists. So we'll see. It's going to be an interesting year for the Sedin twins. It really is. Can the Canucks fix a broken power play? As I said before, their power play went from 1st overall in 2010-11 to 26th overall in 2013-14. And you think of a power play with all the talent that they had on their team, that included Ryan Kessler, that included Jason Garrison when they were still part of the team. It's going to be interesting to see now how their power play will look without Ryan Kessler and with Nick Bonino playing that role instead. I mean, they now have a very good underrated sniper in Radim Verbata. Always had one of the deadlier wrist shots in the game. He'll help out their power play playing the half wall. But how good it's going to be this year? It really all depends. It really does. Which Ryan Miller did the Canucks get? Did they get the one from the Buffalo Sabres that earned a spot on the U.S. Olympic team at the 2014 Sochi Olympics after signing him to a 3-year, $18 million deal? Or did they get the one from the St. Louis Blues that finished the season just poorly, and where the Blues finished the year with a 6-game losing streak when it looked like they had both the Central Division and the Western Conference won. You know, that 6-game losing streak, they lost. They ultimately lost the Western Conference to the Anaheim Ducks, and by 1 point lost the Central Division to the Colorado Avalanche. So they really want to see a good Ryan Miller. They're really hoping Ryan Miller can get himself back in shape and not look like an overage goaltender. Because Eddie Lack, obviously, it's in question whether he's even ready to be a starting goaltender. Same with Jacob Markstrom. But, if Ryan Miller really does struggle, it's going to come down to one of those two, and they may not be ready. So, we'll see. Are any of the young players ready to help? Well, they have a lot of good youngsters in their system that are going to battle for spots on the roster this year. Nicholas Jensen, the Danish forward, was a late-season call-up who had a 3-game goal streak. He was their 29th overall pick in the 2011 draft. He could push the pace and be on their starting lineup this year. Brendan Gaunce, their 26th overall pick in 2012. Speedy winger Hunter Shinkaruk and center Bo Horvat, who were picked 24th overall and 9th overall, respectively, in 2013. Those are guys who could also push for roster spots this year. Whether they're actually going to make it this year remains in question. And finally, which Alexander Edler will show up? Well, we all know that Alexander Edler in years past has been their most valuable defenseman. Particularly in 2011-2012. That year was his best year. He played all 82 games that year, had a career-high 11 goals, a career-high 38 assists, and a career-high 49 points. He only had 34 penalty minutes, and he had a career-high 228 shots on goal with an even plus-minus rating. And in the playoffs that year, through 5 games against the Los Angeles Kings, he had 2 goals, though he was a -2. He had 12 shots on goal and only 8 penalty minutes. So he was really good during that year. And in the lockout-shortened year, he was actually pretty good too. 22 points through 45 games is not that bad, even though he was a -5 that year. Last year, though, just a horrendous year for Alexander Edler. Without a doubt, the worst year of his National Hockey League playing career. As I mentioned before, 7 goals, 15 assists, and 22 points through 63 games, while he had 50 penalty minutes and 178 shots on goal. But that wasn't even. But again, the lack of offensive numbers wasn't even the worst of it. The worst of it was the team worst, career low, and league worst -39 rating. He had the worst plus-minus rating in the National Hockey League last year. He was not a good defensive player last year, when he's usually regarded as being one of the better two-way defensemen in the game, and that brought his career plus-minus rating to a -11. So he's been a minus player the last couple of years. They need Alexander Edler to get back to being the top pair defenseman they know he has the potential to be. So hopefully it all works out for him. And another question I have for the Vancouver Canucks regards another player. Which Alexander Burrows will show up for this upcoming year? He's now 33. The undrafted forward grinder is now 33 years of age. And last year he played 49 games. He played only 49 games, and it was just a horrendous year for him. He only had 5 goals, 10 assists, and 15 points, a -9 rating, which is actually a career low for him. 71 penalty minutes and 104 shots on goal. He had a decent amount of shots on goal, and the penalty minutes were at a decent amount, but he has not been the same. He did not look like the same Alexander Burrows that we saw for 4 straight years before the lockout-shortened year, where he had 28, 35, 26, and 28 goals, respectively, in each of those years. Obviously, 2009-2010 was his best year, was his best regular season. 2010-2011 was considered a relatively rough regular season for him, despite the 26 goals, but he made up for it with a great performance in the playoffs. He was one of their better performers in the playoffs. So, I mean, now, obviously, one could tell you that, yeah, he did some other things on the team that made him look a little bit better than what his statistics showed. He still was a physical force out there. He still played the body, which he still played the body really well. So, so Alexander Burrows is not all forgotten. He still has a potential to play on the top six and maybe even go back to playing with the Sedin twins again. It's very possible. But I personally think Burrows has to have a better year this year. As we now go and take a look at the Vancouver Canucks projected lineup for this year, and unlike what we've seen in years past when Alexander Burrows playing the top line with the Sedin twins, it's now Radim Vrbata who is projected to play on that line. Henrik Sedin playing the center's position, and Daniel Sedin on the left side. Radim Vrbata is projected to play the right side. I think that is a good option because he, again, is more of a sniper, and a good playmaker like Henrik Sedin would be a good fit for a sniper like Radim Vrbata. I think it makes Vrbata look like a better player. So I actually like that line. I think it's a good option for the Vancouver Canucks. Second line, Nick Bonino is the guy expected to be the second line center, at least to begin the year. He'll be expected to center Zach Kassian on the right side, who they expect to get better this year, and Chris Higgins on the left side. Chris Higgins was actually one of the few upsides for Vancouver last year. Even though he was a minus 14 last year, and that is a career low for him, he did have 17 goals and 22 assists for 39 points in 78 games, while only having 30 penalty minutes. But he had 216 shots on goals. He looked like a top six forward last year. Obviously, the minus 14 is rough, and that's a career low for him. But I thought Chris Higgins had a really good year last year. He really pushed the pace, and he did some real good things out there. I think at 31 years of age, he's earned his place on that second line. He's really become a good player ever since joining the Vancouver Canucks. So good job for Christopher Higgins. Third line, Sean Matthias, who was one of their acquisitions in the Roberto Luongo trade. He is expected to be the third line center. He'll center Yannick Hansen on the right and Alexander Burrows on the left. This is a guy who could play either wing side. He's played right wing before. He's spent the last few years on the right wing side with the Sedin twins. He may move back to his natural left wing position if he plays the third line this year. Again, he'll look to challenge one of Chris Higgins, Zach Kassian, or Radim Vrbata for top six forward duty. Because even despite the rough year last year, this is a guy who I think still has the potential to be a top six forward. I really do. Yannick Hansen, he's a really interesting player. Last year I felt like was a bit of a tough year for Yannick Hansen. He's never going to be a big-time scorer in this league, but he is more of a defensive forward. But last year was just kind of a rough year for him. So he was a -9, which was a career low for him. So he'll look to improve on that this season. And then on the fourth line, and then of course Sean Matthias, big body, 6'4", 223 pounds. He's only 26. He won't be 27 until February 19th, so he still has a little bit more time to grow and maybe grow into a solid 20 goal scorer, which he was expected to be when he was drafted by the Detroit Red Wings in the second round, 47th overall in 2006. He has not yet lived up to that last year was an okay year for Sean Matthias, but there's always room for improvement for a player like him. He'll hope to maybe have a career year this year. And then, of course, you got the fourth line. The fourth line for the Vancouver Canucks. Brad Richardson, who was actually a big surprise last year for the Vancouver Canucks. His first year with the Canucks, and he put up some real good numbers and was one of their more valuable players. 11 goals, 12 assists, 23 points, a +1, 39 penalty minutes, and 85 shots on goal through 73 games. It was a real good year. It was a real good year for Brad Richardson. He really came up as a huge surprise. He's only 29. He'll be 30 on February 4th, so he has the potential to do even more. Brad Richardson, he'll be expected to center Lyndon Vay on the right and Derek Dorsett on the left, with Dustin Jeffrey being the 13th guy and Tom Sestito maybe being the 14th guy, or vice versa. Tom Sestito led the team with 213 penalty minutes last year, and that's all he did. All he did was fight and take penalties, which is why it's very possible he may not play as much for the upcoming year. Dustin Jeffrey, we know this is a guy who actually has potential to be a good defensive forward, but he hasn't been given enough of a chance to really show what he could truly do. Maybe at some point the Vancouver Canucks will give him that chance. Derek Dorsett, the thought process is that Lyndon Vay is going to play the right side. Derek Dorsett who's really a natural right winger, will probably have to move to the left side for this season and play the off wing. This gives him a chance to generate better offensive chances. Last year, through 51 games played, 4 goals, 4 assists, 8 points, and a -1 rating, and only 67 shots on goal, but he led the Rangers last year with 128 penalty minutes. He is always a penalty minute machine, and he'll be a much safer option than Tom Sestito. He's not as big as Tom Sestito, obviously, but he is a better player. And through 23 playoff games last year, just 1 assist, -2, 19 penalty minutes, and 20 shots on goal. Though again, he played very well in the Stanley Cup Finals and generated a lot on the forecheck. So they'll look to him to be a good forechecking player. Brad Richardson showed that he could be a good two-way player last year, and Lyndon Vay, he's going to try to kick someone out of the top 9 because he has the potential. We know what Lyndon Vay can do. He has the potential to be much, much more than a fourth-line player. He'll probably begin the year on the fourth line, and if he becomes the offensive player that many people believe he's going to be, he'll probably kick someone out of the top 9 and maybe even the top 6. He's a right winger, but he has the potential to play center. So we'll see. It will be interesting. And hey, maybe Alexander Burrows gets demoted to fourth line duty and pushes Dorsett back to his natural right wing side. That would be a pretty interesting fourth line. Brad Richardson, Derek Dorsett, and Alex Burrows. That would be a good fourth line. But honestly, even without Ryan Kessler, obviously, yeah, there's a lot of questions about this forward group, but I don't think it's the worst forward group I've seen. This forward group has a lot of potential. It really is going to come down to Nick Bonino. He's NHL.com's X Factor, and well-deserved, and that is the right guy to make the X Factor. He's not the guy who has to be better this year. I'll get to that later in the video, obviously, but he is going to be a key part of the team this year, and he'll control the destiny of the team for this year. They also have both forwards, Bo Horvat and Nicholas Jensen, who are going to battle for roster spots this year at some point. Even if it's not in the beginning of the year, it'll come at a point if the team is struggling and they're ready to start utilizing their kids. So it's an interesting situation for the Vancouver Canucks to be in with their forwards. It's not the best forward group in the league, but it's not the worst. Next, we got the defense group. Despite the fact that their defense was really bad last year, especially during that final stretch, there's no denying that as far as the individual players go, it's a pretty deep defense core, probably even better than the forward group, even without Jason Garrison. They have a very formidable top four, with Kevin Bieksa and Alexander Edler as the top pair. They are both very good together. And then Dan Hamhuis and Christopher Tanev as the second pair. Christopher Tanev is a guy who's continuing to prove himself, and he's really proved himself last year. He is a good shutdown defenseman. He's a real good shutdown defenseman, and he really gives Vancouver a lot of options on the back end. Kind of reminds one of a Dan Girardi type player, but actually can skate a little bit better than Dan Girardi can. So that's a good defenseman right there. He's just going to get better. He's only 24, so he's going to get better. Dan Hamhuis, obviously, just so underrated for what he can do. He's always, year in and year out, one of the better shutdown defensemen in the game. We know 2 straight years he was a plus 29 with the Vancouver Canucks in his first 2 years, and then in the lockout shortened year a plus 9, and last year a plus 13. So he's just been a good player for Vancouver since arriving, and has been a key component on their blue line as a shutdown defenseman, and he's 31 years of age. He'll be 32 in December. Now the questions don't really come on that third pair, but I think the addition of Luca Sbisa will solidify that third pair, assuming Sbisa is going to be back to 100% after having so many injuries last year and being scratched so many times. Ryan Stanton, who had a nice year last year, turned out to be a very good depth defenseman and had a really surprising year, actually. No, I don't think anyone really expected him to be as good as he was. More of a shutdown defenseman, only had 1 goal last year, but no one projected him to be as good as he was. He was just a waiver claim from the Chicago Blackhawks, and he turned out to be real good last year. So, he's a nice player. I think he'll go along nicely with Luca Sbisa, and then they obviously have Yannick Weber as a 7th option with guys like Frank Corrado and Henrik Tomarnis as guys who could battle for roster spots as well. Yannick Weber, to me, Yannick Weber is a good player when he's in the lineup, but, sometimes I feel like he doesn't get as much of a chance as he maybe should. So, we'll see. I think that's a good defense group. I think their defense is a little bit safer than their forward group, and actually, I think their defense group may actually be the best part of their team, despite Alexander Edler's league worst minus 39 last year. It would not surprise me if Edler had a comeback year this year. He's under a new coach. He obviously just didn't work out under John Tortorella. Maybe he'll work out under Willie Desjardins. We will see, though. And then in goal, obviously, Ryan Miller is projected to be the starter, and Eddie Lack is projected to be the backup, with Jacob Markstrom projected to be the tertiary guy. Vancouver actually has a really good situation with their goaltending now, and the addition of Ryan Miller made that possible. So, it's a really good situation to be in. Markstrom and Lack will obviously battle for the backup job in training camp. Markstrom is a guy who's had expectations to be a starting goaltender in the past. He has not yet lived up to those expectations, though. So, I think they also still have Joachim Eriksson as one of their goaltenders, too. He's another guy who's projected to be pretty good. Thatcher Demko, obviously, they have now. They have a really good situation in goal now. They've really rebuilt their goaltending depth after the mistimely trades of both Corey Schneider to the New Jersey Devils and Roberto Luongo to the Florida Panthers. There were a lot of thoughts that Corey Schneider was going to be the guy, and he probably should have been the guy, and Luongo should have been traded a long time ago. But because no one wanted Luongo's contract, Gillis scurried and struggled. He was desperate, so in a move of desperation, he moved Corey Schneider, and then ultimately moved Luongo anyway to the Florida Panthers, and that kind of screwed over Vancouver's goaltending situation for the rest of last year. But adding Ryan Miller really solidifies it again. Drafting Thatcher Demko also helps. So, lot to like about Vancouver's goaltending going forward. Whether it's going to be good or not remains a question, because Ryan Miller, again, he is 34 years of age, so there will be questions about him, whether he's going to be the same goaltender or not this year. I personally hope he is. I like Ryan Miller. I've always liked Ryan Miller. He was always a fan favorite throughout the league as well, so hopefully it works out for him. But ultimately, when you look at their forwards, defense, and goaltending, their goaltending is okay. Their goaltending is, I think, solid enough, but a little sketchy as well. Their forward group is okay. It's not a terrible group, but there's still a little bit of concern with it. It may be the weakest part of their team, though. But the defense, I really like the defense. I think that defense is going to be one of the better defense cores in the league, and it's really going to help the Vancouver Canucks moving forward. As we now go and take a look at Vancouver's top 10 prospects. Well, their prospect pool, as far as I can tell, it's not as good as the Calgary Flames, but it's much better. But it is way better than the Edmonton Oilers. It's actually a really good prospect pool. Bo Horvat is their number one guy. Brendan Gaunce is number 2. Jake Virtanen, their 6th overall pick from this past year, is number 3. Hunter Shinkaruk, he's number 4. He's projected to be a Zach Parise type player. Frank Corrado, who's ready to play this year, he's number 5. Nicholas Jensen, number 6. Thatcher Demko, I really like this guy a lot. He's number 7. Dane Fox is number 8. Their first round, 24th overall pick from this year, Jared McCann, is number 9. And then Anton Sederholm is number 10. He's really the one prospect on this top 10 that I personally have really never heard of, but really won't need to know him for another couple of years, obviously. But other than him, this prospect pool is just so good. Not as good as the Flames, like I said, but it is really, really good. I'm really impressed with what the Vancouver Canucks have managed to build. But of all these prospects, after really looking at all these guys, the prospect that really caught my eye the most of all, obviously Bo Horvat, their 9th overall pick from 2013, is their number 1 guy, and well-deserved. However, the player that impresses me the most probably has to be their number 8 prospect, left winger, Dane Fox. And for very good reason. He's undrafted, number 1. He was signed by the Canucks on December 28th of 2013 as a free agent, undrafted. He's 20 years old, and he's only 6 foot, 188 pounds. But last year, for the Erie Otters of the Ontario Hockey League, he had not only had a career year, but was arguably the best player in the entire league. Obviously, Toronto Maple Leafs prospect Connor Brown was the leading point scorer. However, Dane Fox was second in points and was the leading goal scorer. He didn't just lead the Ontario Hockey League in goals, but he led the entire Canadian Hockey League in goals. All 3 leagues combined, he led in goal scoring. Through 67 games played, 64 goals last year for Dane Fox, and 43 assists, 107 points. This guy is going to be so good. He's going to begin his pro career this year. He'll play for the Utica Comets of the American Hockey League. He'll probably need 1 year down there, but whether he'll put up that 64-goal output again in his pro career remains to be seen. Probably not. It may not ever happen, which wouldn't surprise me. But he is a good player, and at the very least, he will be a player who will be looked at to do a little bit of everything. He's kind of an all-around player when it comes down to it. And last year in the OHL playoffs, he had 8 goals and 19 points in 14 games. He was so good in the playoffs as well. He likes to also play a grind. In addition to scoring, he also likes to play a grinding style similar to guys like Dave Bolland and Steve Ott. So he likes to play like them when it comes to the grinding style of the game. But as far as the scoring style goes, maybe a Joffrey Lupul kind of player. I could see that. Maybe kind of being like a Joffrey Lupul type player, shoots the puck well, skates well. But this guy, these statistics just cannot be ignored. Whenever anyone scores 64 goals at any level, that's just impressive. And therefore, Dane Fox is my highlight prospect in this top 10 group. Now, the player on this Vancouver Canucks team who has to be better this year in order for the Vancouver Canucks to be a playoff team. This was actually one of the tougher choices. For this team, it was actually a really tough choice because you got so many guys who have to be better this year. The Sedin twins included. Even though Henrik Sedin did lead the team in points last year, it was only 50 points. So he didn't have a lot. Daniel Sedin was even worse. Zach Kassian, he's going to be expected to be better. Alexander Burrows may be the forward who has to be better, that's for sure. And he was a guy, and he's probably one of the guys I've been thinking about to be the player that needs to be better. But really, and Ryan Miller as well. After the way he ended last year with the St. Louis Blues, you really can't knock out Ryan Miller for being the guy who has to be better. But when it really comes down to it, and from the standpoint of statistics and the expectations as far as the player, his positioning, and where he's playing in the lineup, that's what really made this decision a little bit easier. So, the player who has to be better for the Vancouver Canucks this year, in order for the Canucks to be a better team this year, there is no question about it, has to be defenseman Alexander Edler, the Swedish defenseman with big size, 6'3", 215 pounds, left-handed shot, 28 years of age, won't be 29 until April 21st, native of Östersund, Sweden, former third-round, 91st overall pick by the Canucks of the 2004 NHL entry draft. As I said many times before in this video, and I will say it again, last year was without a doubt Alex Edler's worst season, and not just as far as the offense is concerned. His lack of offensive production wasn't even the big problem last year. It was his league worst, minus 39. He is regarded as being a two-way defenseman who could put up some really good offensive numbers, but also bring a strong defensive game to the table. So when you are expected to bring a strong defensive game to the table, and then you go out there and become a minus 39, that doesn't make for a good season. Kevin Bieksa didn't exactly have a great year either, but he wasn't a minus 39. He was only a minus 8. But Alexander Edler, he's expected to not just be the offensive force on that top pair with Kevin Bieksa, but he's also expected to put up some of the best defensive numbers on the team. Career-wise, his plus-minus numbers were great up until the last couple of years. Obviously, a minus 5 in the lockout-shortened year, but that minus 39 sent his career to a minus 11 rating, career-wise. So, Edler not only has to be better offensively this year, but defensively, he needs to look like the Alexander Edler we've seen in years past. Because if he's not, then the Canucks blue line is going to be very fragile, and they're going to have a lot of problems back there. So yes, Alexander Edler is the player who needs to be better for the Vancouver Canucks this season. Overall, do I think the Vancouver Canucks are a playoff team? You know what? It's actually very, very interesting, and this is actually a very tough choice. All the experts say that Vancouver could be back in the playoffs this year because of Ryan Miller in goal. if they didn't sign Ryan Miller, then it would be a definite no to the Vancouver Canucks being a playoff team because of how inconsistent their goaltending would look with Eddie Lack as the starter and Jacob Markstrom as the backup, or vice versa. With the addition of Ryan Miller to 3 years, $18 million, that's money worth paying to add some stability in goal, despite the fact that he is now 34 years of age, and maybe risk not being the same Ryan Miller anymore. But it's a good risk to take, and it adds stability in goal. It really does. So I don't know. It's really a tough decision for me right now for the Vancouver Canucks, because last year, one thing I actually forgot to mention throughout this whole video was their record last year. Last year they were 36, 35, and 11 with 83 points, 5th in the Pacific Division, and 12th in the Western Conference. Obviously not qualifying for the playoffs, but they still finished with an over 500 record last year by 1 game. Obviously, that's not enough, but they were the 3rd worst team in the Western Conference last year, behind their fellow Canadian rivals, the Calgary Flames and the Edmonton Oilers, and another Canadian rival, the Winnipeg Jets, were 11th. So it was not a good year for the Western Canadian teams. They were the 4 worst teams in the Western Conference last year, and Vancouver was just behind Winnipeg. So you got to think, though, that now with more stable goaltending, they'll be able to improve on that 36, 35, and 11 record and have more points. But we'll see. This is actually a really tough decision. At the very least, I do think they'll be a better team than they were last year, believe it or not. I think they made enough moves to maybe improve on last year, even without Ryan Kessler as their second-line center, and even without Jason Garrison to man the point on the power play with that big shot of his. Am I saying they're a playoff team? It's tough to say. I definitely think they're a bubble team this year, and they'll fight for the 8th and final playoff spot. But I guess when I really, really think about it, though, even though the analysts say that they will make even though the experts are taking a gamble and saying that they will be a playoff team this year, I personally am going to say probably not. Only for this reason. I think it's going to be a good year for Ryan Miller, and I think it's going to be a good year for the Canucks, and they'll have much more wins than losses. But I think for them, it's going to come down to the last day of the season. I think you have to also look at teams like the Arizona Coyotes and the San Jose Sharks. Those two, along with the Vancouver Canucks, are all going to battle for that final 3rd division lead spot, because it's expected that the 5 Central Division teams that made the playoffs last year are going to make the playoffs again. The St. Louis Blues, the Colorado Avalanche, the Chicago Blackhawks, the Minnesota Wild, and the Dallas Stars. They're all expected to be better. But then you look at, those teams, plus the Nashville Predators, who are also going to be in that bubble spot, but just miss just because of how much better the other teams got. It's real interesting, but obviously you can't count the Nashville Predators because you can't have more than 5 teams in one division in the playoffs, and no less than 3. You gotta expect that the Pacific Division is ultimately going to be the weakest division in the NHL once again, but in result of this, could end up being the most competitive division as far as clinching that final division leader spot. The San Jose Sharks are expected to be one of the teams to battle for that, as they're not expected to be as good as they've been in the past couple of seasons. The Arizona Coyotes, obviously Mike Smith, one of the better goaltenders in the NHL now. And the Coyotes, obviously, with their defensive system, you can never knock them out. You really can't. And then you got the Vancouver Canucks, who are going to battle very hard this year I think it'll be a good year for them, but I think the Coyotes and Sharks are slightly better than them. I mean, I definitely think the Sharks are slightly better than them. With the Coyotes, obviously, they're the team I'll be doing tomorrow. I'll be able to look at their roster a little bit better tomorrow and really give a better opinion between those two teams specifically as to who I think is going to be better. Because I honestly don't really know the Coyotes roster that well right now. I know they really didn't do too much over the offseason, though. So, whereas the Vancouver Canucks were one of the more active teams during the offseason, and without a doubt, the most active Canadian team. So, you got to think that they're going to be in the mix to make the playoffs, but ultimately, I still think in today's game, Mike Smith is a better goaltender than Ryan Miller right now, because I think Ryan Miller, again, he's really old now. Mike Smith still got a couple of years of prime left. So as of right now, Mike Smith is a better goaltender. And then with the San Jose Sharks, you look at their forward depth. You just can't deny that forward depth, despite how inconsistent their goaltending looks. So, I think for all intensive purposes, I'm going to say no to the Vancouver Canucks being a playoff team. I think it'll be a very good season for them, and I think it'll be a comeback year for Ryan Miller. I think Nick Bonino will have a good year. I think he will possibly live up to that second-line center role, but no. The Vancouver Canucks, for all intensive purposes, are not a playoff team this year. And that'll do it for episode 158 of Hockey on the Spot. Thank you all for joining me today. Be sure to tune in again tomorrow. We are officially done with all the Canadian teams. The Vancouver Canucks were the last Canadian team. For the final 4 episodes, we're almost done. We are almost done. For the final 4 episodes, all American teams. So be sure to join me again tomorrow when we talk about the Arizona Coyotes. So until then, this has been Hockey on the Spot with Brandon Barenfeld. I'm Brandon Barenfeld. Thank you all for joining me, and I'll see you all again tomorrow. Thank you all, and have a great night.